My name is Earl Dean Sisto, and I come from San Carlos Indian Reservation in Arizona. I was brought up in a traditional way, Apache way. We lived in Wickiup when I was growing up, and on to frame house, tent, and then we lived all kinds of ways, and then, but the earlier part of my life was a lot of traditional way, participating in religious activities, Apache religion, the 32 religion.
I'm James writing in. I am a Pawnee, and I was born in Oklahoma in 1949. It was difficult going to Los Angeles, especially having been raised in small communities in Oklahoma, New Mexico, and even Montana while I was young.
My name is Phil Hale, and I'm from the Navajo Nation.
I grew up on the Gila River Indian community here in Saskatoon, and my father is a member of the Gila River tribe, and my mother is Ogallala Lakota from Pine Ridge. But I'm enrolled at Gila River, and I grew up for the most part of my life here at Gila River, and grew up and went to the BIA schools and all the way through middle school and high school as well here.
And I relocated here in 1964 through the government relocation program. I came 1964. I got married in the late 60s, and I was working for a General Telephone Company, Southern California General Telephone Company, and then I decided to go back to school. So I wanted to come to UCLA. So what I used to do is I used to drive on Sunset Boulevard, right? Just to look at the campus, but it looked so intimidating, I'd drive away. So I was so scared of it. But the high potential program started during that time. And I was the second group that came in, the fall, and I came in the winter.
I went to UCLA after teaching on the reservation for 4 years, and I decided that I should pursue a graduate education. I went to UCLA as a major in American Indian Studies at the master's level. I stayed on and completed my PhD in 1991.
When I was a senior, me and my family, we always, attended the UCLA Powell back in the 70s, early 80s. And then back then, we had a good family friend that worked there, Earl Sisto. And I knew he went to school there, and he was working there at the time. And in high school, when I went to my college counselor, he looked at my transcript and pretty much said, you can go wherever you want. And I was interested in going to UCLA.
I was recruited by the native recruiter at the time, Earl Sisto, and he was very persistent about coming out, and I finally was won over. Although I spent most of my life here in Arizona, I really sort of was actually excited by the chance of going to LA to attend UCLA. Coincidentally, that's where my father attended law school from '69 to I believe '71. So I was a baby then from my dad's last year there at UCLA.
There were like 300 brown students here, and what had happened is that the Chicanos, Asians, and Afro-American encouraged the Indian to start the high potential program. So they just got a whole bunch of people from the Los Angeles area and outside to come to school here, and that was an incredible thing, because it was actually fun, to be with other Indians. I graduated here in 1974, and we knew that there were remains here during that time, and we had talked to professors to see what can be done to, put them back where they belong, and then we're always given an answer that they didn't know which tribe they belonged to, so nobody would claim. And then after I graduated here, I went to Cal State LA, worked as a recruiter for the Educational Opportunity Program, and then I spent 2.5 years there, and I came back here to UCLA. I wanted to go to a management program, so I got a job here as a community representative. And during that time, that issue is still a big concern for the Indian people.
One day we're riding the elevator, the express elevator in Campbell Hall, and when we got to the third floor, we got out and we noticed that the walls were being painted, that renovation was going on. So we began asking questions. What's going on here? Why are they doing this? And that's how we found out that the administration had planned to move AIS, American Indian Studies, to Haines Hall. And Campbell Hall is a very important landmark on the UCLA campus because that is where a lot of protests took place in the 60s that led to the development of the ethnic studies programs at UCLA. There was even a young Indian man that was shot in that building. So it was the landmark of the struggle, and many of us thought that AIS and the other ethnic studies belonged there. Repatriation became an important issue at UCLA in the late 1980s. I understand that prior to my going there in '83, that repatriation had surfaced periodically. But when I was there, some of us become concerned about the storing of human remains, and that concern arose from a plan to move American Indian Studies from the third floor of Campbell Hall next door to to Haines Hall, where human remains were stored. And the plan of the university was to put AIS, American Indian Studies, in the basement of Haines Hall. So we had some Navajos that were working at UCLA. V. Salabai was her name, Earl Sisto, who's Apache. And they were the ones, I think, that began to first express concern about that possible move because of spiritual reasons, because of their belief about the dead.
We took up positions and said that we don't want to move over there because there are remains there. And then we're not supposed to be in the same building with the remains. That's so inappropriate for Indian people to be a part of that. Since that means that if we move there, we're condoning that. So we put up a protest not to move there.
And what they began to tell us resonated with us because it's an issue that's very important. Why would we want to be placed in a setting where a potential harm could come to present-day people? As a result of that, we began to ask questions. Why are these remains at UCLA? How did they get there? Who controls them? Who owns them? What are they being used for? In response to our questions, John Redhorse, who was the director of American Indian Studies at that time at UCLA, was very supportive of us. To my knowledge, he's the only faculty person who did support us. He encouraged us, actually. He provided me with, and others with research monies to begin to do a survey to ask California tribes what they thought about repatriation, what should be done with those remains. And we conducted telephone surveys, calling different tribes and speaking to people at the tribal offices, and virtually all of them said that those remains should be returned for reburial, and it should be done as soon as possible. So I think if it wasn't for John, it would have been very difficult for us to create the movement that we did at UCLA. And it was, I think, the graduate students at UCLA that began to raise this as an issue first. Myself, Jeremy Rockman, Marie Williams was there, and she is a Tlingit from Alaska. And our organization began to ask these questions about why those remains are there. Why aren't they reburied? What value are they? So Redhorse set up a meeting, or actually not a meeting, but he began to carry on dialogue with anthropology, which archaeology is a part of. And out of that discussion, our archaeologists decided together to put together a series of programs that would inform us of the scientific value of those remains. The meetings set up by the archaeologists were to convince us that the research that they were doing had implications not only for Indians but humankind as a whole. So programs are set up that brought speakers in to talk about scientific research with native remains. We went to those meetings and we were convinced that our beliefs, our attitudes, and our rights were more important in these matters because these were our ancestors, deceased natives that were being stored and studied. The native remains came to UCLA mainly through archaeology, but we had this unique legacy of being considered America's cultural resources. Archaeologists thought that they had a right to go out and to excavate remains and to put those remains in institutions, which was done in accordance with law, for the public good. Well, we asked questions, what do Indians get out of this? We don't see Indians getting any benefit out of this except disrespect, mistreatment, our rights being violated. It was during the late 60s that Indians began to formally challenge the work of archaeologists and the desecration that was being done in the name of science. And that desecration I'm referring to is the looting of Indian graves. It began with primarily as graduate students, and then we got the undergraduate students involved. Steve Lewis came to UCLA in 1989, and he saw this as an important issue. Laura Canis, a Pechanga, she was a young, probably 18-year-old freshman at the time, and she accepted this premise. And this was very important that Laura become involved because she was a California Indian. Most of us were from out of state, and she could speak on behalf of her people, and that's very important that we had that voice. So she would get up in front of these groups, these meetings. After the presentations, we would be given a chance to speak our view. And we presented, our spiritual concerns, our human rights concerns, and Laura became one of the speakers at those forums, as did Steve Lewis, myself, and Jeremy Rockman. Others became involved and were very important to the process as well.
I think what was the initial impetus was that there was a meeting being held between the anthropology department and the American Indian Studies. Both James and Jeremy had wrote a resolution condemning UCLA's I guess they had written a resolution condemning UCLA's I guess the policy that allowed them to have remains on campus. And what they did was they wrote this resolution, and up to this time I was sort of following them to different meetings with other with other Indian students, and other meetings that were leading up to this one particular meeting. And then all of a sudden they weren't going to go to that meeting. They said, here, this resolution, this is for you and for Asa and for the other person, which was Laura Canis at the time, Pechanga native, who was also an active member in Asa. And they said, this is for Asa to take the lead in now. He said, we've prepped you on this, we've brought you along, we've educated you on this issue and how important it is to Native Americans to have this issue come to the forefront. And so in that way, they sort of passed the torch to us, this new generation of students Indian students at UCLA. So we took this resolution into this meeting, and we presented it to these anthropology graduate students and professors. And I just remember going into Haynes Hall. That was the first time I went into Haynes Hall, and we had said a small prayer before we walked in and presented this resolution. And as we presented it, we initially we sort of hushed this audience of anthropologists and archaeologists there, and immediately they started to attack the resolution as it was written, and how dare they, meaning us, in the name of academic freedom, present this resolution, and so from then, the meeting shortly ended thereafter. So I think that was the first salvo in bringing that issue to the forefront at UCLA. From then on, we started to plan rallies. I think what ASA did was we tried to. I think in the spirit of the confrontational politics of the 1970s and of post-Alcatraz, I think that's where we took our lead from. I think early on, from my mentoring from James, writing in, and Jeremy Rockman, we sort of saw ourselves as part of this continuous fight for Native rights, especially within UCLA, and the history that UCLA has played in student activism, from Alcatraz, from fighting for Native-based curriculum at UCLA, for fighting for just a place for Native Americans in the academic setting at UCLA. We saw ourselves as a continuation of that, and in the late 80s, early 90s, we mounted a campaign of first of confrontation, but also tempered with educating both our fellow students, faculty, and the administration, the real decision makers at UCLA, about repatriation, and about how abhorrent that was to Native American sensibility and spirituality.
Our remains, they were ceremoniously, put to rest, when their life ended, and here, it gets redug up, and for some reason, these non-Indians can't understand, what that means, or what that means to tribes, different tribes, how that is sort of like taboo for that to be done. There's the issue of non-respect, the issue of just not giving a care in the world about it's like history there. It's like, I guess they felt like, well, there's either no Indians around or there's hardly Indians around, so we won't be bothered by them. We'll just dig up these cemeteries and dig up these bones so we can study them. To me, that's kind of like the attitude that they had. And we were there just saying, we're still here, we're still alive, and that doesn't need to be done.
Important. It's a form of respect for our ancestors, our elders, and they have to be back where they're at. And so it's a religious thing. Once a person dies, you don't tamper with them, and you don't, in Apache way, you don't even mention their names. Once they're gone, they're gone. They're in the other world, and that's where they belong. So they should be respected and put in a peaceful resting place.
One of the things that I consider is that, as Indian people, we have an obligation to our ancestors, to our relatives. And in terms of repatriation, those of us that have this calling to do this cannot shun our responsibility. We have to do whatever it takes to get the remains of our ancestors out of these institutions and placed back in the ground, into Mother Earth, where they belong.
How would you like it if we, dug up like George Washington's bones? We'd be put in prison for that. Why can't it work the other way?
It's the same thing with like the Greeks. They had these statues that the English had taken, in their museum. They don't want to give it back. And it's the same thing here. And then they say we can keep them. It's not a matter of keeping them and storing them. It's a matter of respect for the people and put them back where they belong.
it kind of raised my curiosity, is like why, the anthro department wanted it there, because they wanted to study, how Indians lived long ago. But, to me, it's like, why couldn't they just ask, us or, some of our old people what we ate or what we did, in our daily lives.
Repatriation is an issue that most people can relate to, because they want their ancestors, their loved ones, treated properly, both in death and in life.
There were more dead Native bodies at UCLA than there were recruited to go to school at UCLA. So there were more dead natives at UCLA than there were alive Native students. And in a school supposedly of higher learning, that was sort of a bitter irony for Native Americans to swallow. The Native human remains issue, for myself, coming from a very, I wouldn't say traditional Native American family, but a family that practiced their spirituality and their religion. I think for me, I was, as I entered and took classes, and I tried not to take classes at Haynes Hall, and I know that there was a turning point for me where I couldn't, if I was going to continue on that discipline, I couldn't, I'd have to start taking classes at Haynes Hall, and for me, it was too much for me to handle, and something that I never really talked about too much, but I'll share with you, was that I actually dealt with a lot of really spiritual issues at that time. I could, and I know I wasn't alone though, really feel those human remains there in Haynes Hall. You could actually feel that from a spiritual sense as a Native American, and that spirit of desecration and that spirit of disrespect that they were laying in, I think really affected me, and I subsequently had to have certain ceremonies to not only protect me but also to sort of keep me cleansed and in a spiritual sense as a Native American. And I know that occurred with a couple of other students at ASA, where it really hit them and affected them hard as well. So it was an issue that we not only dealt with as a political issue, but it was, and as we tried to explain to and educate to the larger UCLA environment, that it was an institution that we at that time we lived with day in and day out. Some of the biggest opponents at that time were, I believe, the heads of the anthropology department, and actually the Anthropology Graduate Students Association, which we were always going to head to head in debates that were held on campus, and as you sort of attack an issue within an institutional context, it's the institution itself that I believe that we were at odds with. So I don't think necessarily it was one personality per se, but it was a whole mindset, an ideology, that academic freedom and the freedom of anthropologists and archaeologists to study human remains trumped any type of religious, political protections that we as Indian people had. So I would say it went right up and I would hold the chancellor at that time, Chancellor Young, responsible as well for playing the politician and for always having an institutional response, which was just to pass the buck and to try to wait us out. And so I would say in that respect, it was, anybody, I don't think we really got any support from any tenured professor within anthropology or archaeology. And the pressure we were putting on those departments, I know it was hard, because there were a couple of Native American grad students in anthropology. And I know that was a difficult, because myself, I knew them personally, and I know we sort of put them at odds between, were they going to be loyal to their academic discipline, or were they going to be loyal to who they were as Native Americans? And I didn't try to force that issue on them. I think they made their own decisions. An important part was coalition building among other student groups and other groups at UCLA, and also with the Indian community in Los Angeles, in Southern California. And so I think what really kept and drove that issue was that we looked at the fact that most of those Native American remains were California Native remains, and how that linked to the history of Native California populations with the state of California, with how California was colonized. So we felt it was important and incumbent upon us to outreach to as many local Native communities as possible. And you have to understand, at that time, this was before Indian gaming, and California tribes at that time weren't necessarily as active and as forefront on the political California scene as they are now. So it was interesting to see how we as Indian students helped to empower these and to give them a voice, especially in an institution like UCLA. And in regards to building coalitions with other student groups at UCLA, this was an issue that was a driver for, I think, the overall Indian agenda, where African American students had their issues, Chicano students had their issues, Mecha, Asian Pacific Islanders had their issues, and this was sort of the focal point for our agenda. And we were very, I think, successful in bringing those groups together behind us. And as we planned walkouts of the Haynes Hall, which was the anthropology department that housed those remains, of not just that this was not just a Native American issue. This was an issue of respect for humanity, and we, as Indian students, only constituted, I think it was less than, at that time, it was like less than 1% of the population. But once we built a strong coalition with other student groups, we, I think, began to get the ear of the administration. And around that time too, leading up to, there was the quincentenary at the time, the so-called Columbus holiday that was impending. So, there were a lot of issues at that time that I think that fed us, and that sort of put our political activity as Indian students, I think it sort of put that into context where, we were kind of riding a crest of this new revitalization that Native Americans were experiencing nationwide and throughout the Western Hemisphere. And I think at UCLA, what was going on at the time was sort of a microcosm of what was going on in the larger context within Native America.
We also wrote letters to the Daily Bruin, and created awareness on campus about what was going on in the name of science with our ancestors.
It got to a point where, started making the headlines of the Daily Bruin, and what really started everything was a few students from ASA one night started chalking up the sidewalks around UCLA, putting slogans like UCLA has skeletons in their closet, repatriation now, and the next day everybody saw it. Everybody saw it on the sidewalks, and right then it just kind of took off. And then we started having more like symposiums, workshops, or seminars on repatriation geared towards Native Americans and Native American remains, getting people from experts from Indian experts from across the nation to come and talk, and that's how it all started.
The Haynes Hall walkout, we really didn't know exactly how successful that was going to be, actually, and the planning that went into it was basically had to do with ASA just sort of getting the word out about an impending walkout, and we thought it was only going to be us Indian students participating in the walkout, but to see other graduate students in archaeology, physical anthropology, walking out, professors in anthropology walking out and standing with us.
I stood right in front of the building next door, and I said my prayer, and there was hundreds of people there. And then I talked to the remains, and I told them that we're trying to do everything we can to take you back to your homeland, and then just to be patient with us, and then eventually, hopefully, that we'll be successful.
From there, there was about 4 students from ASA, including myself, that continued that, and to the Chancellor's office in Murphy Hall, I believe at the time, and we had a resolution and a petition that we wanted to present him. So we continued over to Murphy Hall and to the Chancellor's office to present these documents to him, and we actually we thought it was just going to be us 4 students. It turned into most of the people that were there at the rally that followed us into Murphy Hall, and by the time we walked over, I guess word had spread that there was a student protest that was impending. That was I guess about to take over Murphy Hall, and so they thought that we were actually going to be taking over Murphy Hall. So they had the campus police out, and by then the Chancellor and his whole office and staff they had locked the doors on us. So we stood outside, and we basically yelled in that we weren't gonna leave until we at least were able to present those 2 documents. Whereby they, about 10-15 minutes later, they opened the door and they let myself in, and they had the Chancellor and some of his aides that were there, and they were very excited to I guess just in a word, they were they were thinking that Murphy Hall was actually going to be taken over by this group of demonstrators, and basically all I said was I just wanted to present this resolution and this petition to you that all of the students and the people there signed, that we're all in solidarity on this issue of repatriation, that this is slap in the face to Native Americans, and that this policy of holding human remains and the history behind how UCLA, an institution of UCLA stature, had gotten those was abhorrent, and that this violated all types of humanity and international law as it affected indigenous groups and human rights within an international context, and within the protections of the United States as well. So I presented those documents to them, and they said, "Well, is that all you want?" I said, "That's all we wanted to do. We just wanted our voices to be heard, our concerns to be heard by you who are the decision makers at this institution, the Chancellor and his aides." And we didn't want any more or any less, but just to be accorded that respect as humans, as students there at UCLA, and to put them on notice that we weren't going to stop until our concerns were handled to the best of their ability, and to what we thought was I guess a solution that was in the best interest of California tribes there. I think with that Haines walkout, I think that was a high point that we built upon, and that really sent a strong message to the administration, that we were not only getting support from the California Native tribes locally, but we were also building support from student groups and from the professors and staff members as well. So we were building support. We were getting support not only from outside but also from within as well. And we got a lot of media coverage from that, from I think from the LA Times, from some television stations as well, that really gave us some good exposure, to that issue. So I think that was sort of a benchmark in the repatriation struggle at that time.
The struggle at UCLA was being replicated at other places and other times. I think that we had a good collection of people at UCLA, and people, I mean Indian students, and our mentor John Redhorse, who were there at the right time, and we saw this issue, we saw the significance of it, and we went forward with it. There was a lot of grassroots struggles going on. One of the most inspirational people I met in this process was when I was a student at UCLA. One of the things that UCLA did, or actually it was John Redhorse through the American Indian Studies Center, was to provide funding for me to go to the World Archaeology Conference in Vermilion, South Dakota in 1989. And that was a very eye-opening experience. There were people there that I met, Robert Cruz, Pamina Yellowbird, and others that had been involved in this struggle for many years. And to hear them get up and articulate their positions to these archaeologists, to this World Council, was just very impressive for me, and it just motivated me even more and convinced me of the righteousness of what we were doing at UCLA. So, in a lot of different places, we had this movement was going on, struggles were going on, and we had a core of very dedicated people who were going to see this battle to its end. I believe it was the fall of 1990, NAGPRA became law, which in many ways was a sweeping piece of legislation that recognized the sovereignty of Indians to claim our own dead. So, it opened up an avenue for us to get back remains. When NAGPRA was signed into law in 1990, I was at ASU. I had accepted a position in the School of Justice Studies at Arizona State, and like others, I think I was very happy that this law was passed. It's something that was a long time overdue. But that movement, as I'd mentioned earlier, had been going on for a while. And the message of the movement was something that the American mainstream could accept. And we had some, I think, good political support by Senator Daniel Inouye, John McCain, and others that were very supportive of this law. But there's a lot of unfinished business yet, and we're still struggling. Some people think just because we have NAGPRA that the battle is over. It's not.
Upon hearing about Bush's signing of the NAGPRA legislation, really brought home the fact that we, as American Indian students, that we were victorious to some extent in realizing a protection on Native rights in regards to Native funerary objects, native human remains, that what we were doing at UCLA had ramifications, and that nationwide, that those protections would be available not only in California but obviously across the United States. And we hoped at the time that would be comprehensive enough, that would have some concrete protections that we should have already been accorded, that it would recognize that, that as Native Americans, that we shouldn't be singled out in that respect. I think as in the victories that we won, or I think the positive impact, I think that more to the point that I saw as an undergraduate student was that we raised consciousness about, from that issue, from repatriation, we linked that with other issues of Indian sovereignty, issues of what happened not only to Indians in general in regards to Columbus and the quincentenary and the genocide and the history, not only of the United States but also of California tribes as well. I think ASA, I think a small victory, but a victory that stays with me still was as the American Indian Student Association, we represented the diversity of what is the Native American experience. There were students that came from traditional families, that came from reservations, came from pueblos, came from traditional settings, students that came from urban settings, students that had a strong developed identity and knew their language and culture. There were students that didn't know their culture, that maybe were exposed to it for the first time by ASA or at UCLA as a student there. And I think the biggest, impact in my life, and I would say a small victory, was that we came together. We all came together on this issue. Students from different tribes, from different tribal backgrounds, and from different cultural backgrounds. We came together. We transcended those issues that sometimes divide Indian communities on a national or intertribal level. That we came together and we really stayed focused on that issue of repatriation at UCLA. And although that it wasn't all smooth, that there were certain rocky times, and there was certainly dissension among how we were going to attack that issue, whether we were going to attack it straight on, whether we were going to, I think we balanced our rhetoric and our action with actual reality of how we wanted to make some concrete change at UCLA. So we didn't, we didn't get upset that we weren't going to have all the remains repatriated, within 1 year. I feel that we, within the national repatriation campaign, I feel that we really played a part in pushing that issue on a national scale as well. I know that we've had representatives from NARF that came and met with ASA. Walter Echohawk, at the time, he was working on the repatriation legislation for the Smithsonian, as well as working on the what will later be called the NAGPRA, Native American Graves and Repatriation Act as well. And so we met with him, and he wanted our input, and we gave him, everything, the information that we had at UCLA. I was, for myself, pleased that we could make a positive impact, especially on the national scale as well. Members of ASA and the ALSA, the American Indian Law Students Association, also we gave testimony to the California State Assembly on repatriation issues having to do with the UC system and with any higher learning institution in California. There was an act pending on that, and so we also participated in that as well as giving testimony. So to me, I think my time there, in regards to having a positive impact, I think we sort of laid the groundwork for the ultimate across-the-board repatriation of human remains and cultural items. So I think looking back, I think I was proud to play a small part in getting that ball rolling, and opening up really critical lines of communication, forcing those lines of communication to be open between the American Indian community at UCLA and with the administration and with the powers that be within the Department of Anthropology. So I think I would look at it in that context. As I see it, is an issue that's unresolved, and what I'm learning is that among Native American issues, they're fluid, and that they're cycles, and that we always have to be ready and be in a place to fight these, and to be able and to want to love our people and to love our freedom and our sovereignty enough to want to stand up and fight for our people and fight for our rights. I was taught at a very young age that wherever you go, you sort of take your people, you shoulder your people and shoulder your ancestors. And I believe as an Indian student, especially at UCLA, that's no different. You're not only there for yourself to get an education, but you're bringing your people along with you. And the positive contributions that you can make as a Native student not only have repercussions, they have repercussions beyond your life. They have repercussions all the way down through your family, back home, wherever that may be, and your ancestors. So I believe that when we were fighting for an issue like repatriation, we were fighting for our ancestors. We were giving voice to them, and so that's something that, as Native students, I believe you can't get away from. That you're indelibly connected to your ancestors in that way, and how, looking back at how the campaigning and the struggle for the repatriation of Indian remains, how that played into that, was inseparable as you're linked to your ancestors as Native students, as Native human beings.
Niga da da edi go